Hi, I'm Sabrina, and today I'm going to show you how I turned a Pendleton wool blanket that I found at a thrift store for 10 bucks into a glorious tailored coat. Along the way, I'm going to show you a few key skills that every beginner sewer needs to learn, including how to think about print placement when cutting your garment, and how to tailor your coat using fusible interfacing. All right, we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. Let's start by talking about pattern selection. Because my fabric has a really gorgeous large-scale print, I thought the best way to showcase the print would be to find a coat pattern with as few seam lines and darts as possible, so the print doesn't get broken up. I also still wanted the coat to have some tailoring, as I've made some relaxed coats before that always end up looking like bathrobes. So after looking at what seemed like every coat pattern on the internet, I finally decided to go with an indie pattern designer and use the Oslo coat pattern from Tessuti Fabrics. The Oslo is a slightly cocoon-shaped, oversized coat with a shawl collar, and I was drawn to it because it has only a few seam lines and it has a really nice, crisp, tailored look. The first step in making the coat is to cut the fabric. I've already printed out and taped together all of the pattern pieces. Oh, and by the way, if you don't know how to assemble a PDF pattern, I've included a link in the description below to some tutorials that will walk you through the process. I've sorted the pattern pieces into two piles, one with the pattern pieces for the exterior of the coat, and one with the lining and interfacing pattern pieces. I'm going to set aside the lining and interfacing pattern pieces for now and focus just on cutting out the pieces for the exterior of the coat. Because my fabric has a very large-scale print, I needed to think carefully about where to cut the fabric and where to place the different motifs on the garment. Now with a lighter weight fabric, I would usually just pin up the fabric on the dress form and experiment there. But with this heavy wool fabric, that's just not feasible. So instead, I decided to experiment with print placement in Photoshop. And if you don't know how to do that, I made a tutorial on it, which I will link in the description to this video. After playing around a bit in Photoshop, I eventually found a layout that I liked, which was to put the big orange stripe going down the side of the coat and the blue and black square motif going down the middle of the front and the back of the coat. The next step, of course, is to actually execute on your planned print placement when cutting out the fabric. Now, I'm assuming you don't have a ton of extra fabric for your project, and so you don't have the luxury of being able to pick the print placement for all of your pattern pieces. So you're going to have to be strategic about where you want to be picky about print placement. So for me, I thought it was most important to have good print placement on the front and the back body of the coat. And I think I'll have enough fabric to give me some good options there. But I don't think I'll have enough fabric to be picky about where to put the print on my sleeves. So I'm going to set those pattern pieces aside from now and just cut out those pieces from whatever leftover fabric I have after cutting out the front and back pieces of the coat. Now on the front back pieces of the coat, there are a few key places that I want to keep in mind when I'm deciding where to cut the fabric. One is the finished edge of the hem, because I don't want to cut off a big motif at the hem if I can possibly avoid it. The Oslo pattern includes 2 inches of fabric to be turned up for the hem. So I've marked a blue line on the pattern piece that's 2 inches from the bottom of the front and back pattern pieces. That line shows me where the finished hem will be, so I can keep that in mind when I'm putting the pattern on the fabric. Now the second is the center of the front piece, because I need to make sure that the print will line up properly when the coat is closed. Now sometimes patterns will mark the center front of the garment, but the Oslo does not do that, so I had to mark it myself. Now on double-breasted coat styles, the center front is in between the 2 buttons, which are marked here. So I just measured halfway between the button markings and drew a line down the center. Now that I've marked those important parts of the front and back pattern pieces, I can start laying out the pattern pieces on the fabric. I'm going to start by laying out the back piece. First, I need to fold the bottom of the pattern piece to the line marking the finished hem. Then, I'm going to center my back pattern piece
on the blue and black square motif so that the orange stripe goes down the side. I then want to move my pattern piece up and down to make sure that there are no motifs getting cut off at the hem. Now it's time to move on to the front piece. This time, I need to fold the pattern at that center front line we marked earlier. Plus, I need to fold up the bottom so I can see where the finished hem will be. Then, I can place the center front line in the middle of this blue and black square motif, similar to what I did with the back pattern piece. And again, I need to position my pattern piece so that no motifs are getting cut off at the hem. Once the pattern piece is positioned properly, I can fold out the parts of the pattern that I folded in, and then I'm ready to cut. One thing to note when you're cutting out your back pattern piece. The back pattern piece says to cut on the fold, but I never do that when I'm worried about print placement, because cutting on the fold just isn't precise enough. Instead, I will cut out half the pattern piece and then flip the pattern over and cut out the other half to ensure that I have really precise print placement on both sides of the back piece. With the front piece, I'm going to cut out one side of the front, then try to position the pattern piece the same way on the other side, so I end up with two front pieces that are mirror images of each other. Okay, now I've cut out the front and back body pieces, and I only have a bit of fabric left over for the sleeves. I don't have enough fabric to be picky about where to place the pattern, so I'm just going to cut the pieces so the orange stripe runs down the length of the arm on both the front and the back sleeve pieces. It's maybe not ideal, but whatever. I still think this will look okay. Again, when you cut out the other set of sleeve pieces, make sure you position the pattern pieces in the same place, so you end up with mirror images in your sleeve pieces. You don't want to end up with sleeves that look asymmetrical. So as you can see, we don't have very much fabric left after we've cut out all the body pieces. We're not going to have enough fabric to cut out this entire piece all in one go. So what we're going to have to do is piece together this front piece, this front-facing piece. We have to cut everything above what's called the break point of the coat out of the exterior fabric. And the break point is right here, marked by this notch here. Everything above the break point will show through to the other side, because as you can see, it will flip out like so. Everything below the break point will sit on the inside of the coat, and so we can cut that part out of whatever leftover fabric I happen to have in my stash. So when I'm laying out the pattern piece on the fabric, I have to make sure that I'm able to squeeze out enough yardage here. So I've been playing around with the layout of the facing pattern piece on my actual fabric, and I think I've come up with something that just barely fits on the little remaining fabric that I have, and I think it's gonna look pretty nice. So let me show you. So I put the front facing piece like so right on this edge. We're not going to be able to squeeze two complete pieces out of the facing, and I really need that lapel to be a mirror image on both sides. So what I'm going to do is basically take this part here as the middle piece, the middle line, and cut one top facing part here and the other top facing part there as a mirror image. And so what I'm going to do is basically just cut this top part here above the fold. Like we said before, everything above the break line will show on the outside, but everything below the break line will not.
And so this is my way of just making sure that I get the correct placement on the top of the break line, because that's what's going to show up near the face, but everything below we can hedge by cutting out of something else because it's not going to show, it's just going to be on the inside of the coat. So you can see here's the midline here. I'm just going to place the fabric a little bit to the side of that because I need a seam allowance to piece together those pieces. And I'm just going to place my pattern pieces like so. And just grabbing my scissors, I'm going to cut down this midline here. Using the design as a guide. Then just cut the top part of the pattern. Finally, we just need to cut the last part of the facing. And like saying earlier, it doesn't hugely matter where exactly you place your print for this particular piece because it's going to be on the inside anyway. I'm just going to try to squeeze what I can, I think, this way. Because it's really, as you can see, I don't have that much fabric left. So it's really the only way to be able to get symmetrical pieces on both sides, which I do still want, because I don't want, even though the facing is going to be just on the inside, I don't want it to flip out and look hideously mismatched. Still have some pride, even though it's just going to be on the inside of the garment. So let's place our pieces like so. And as I was saying earlier, you do need to leave a little bit of a seam allowance. So I had decided that I was going to, I cut off the front facing piece up to here, and I'm just leaving a little bit of seam allowance there. Okay, now that the exterior pieces are all cut out, I just need to cut out the facing pieces. These pieces will be on the inside of the garment, so we don't need to worry about print placement. I already cut out the last two facing pieces, which I was just barely able to squeeze out from the leftover scraps from the Pendleton blanket. This is all the fabric that's left, and very efficient in this project. So next I'm going to cut out the interfacing and lining pieces. I'm using some white Bemberg lining. Bemberg, if you don't know, is a classic lining fabric made out of cupro that is breathable and very affordable. It's widely used to line jackets and coats, and it feels pretty nice to the touch. It's not quite as nice feeling as something like silk charmeuse or silk crepe, but it's much cheaper, so that's the trade-off. For interfacing, I'm using some lightweight woven fusible interfacing. I think this one is from Pellon, but honestly the brand doesn't matter too much. Just get any woven fusible interfacing and make sure that the weight of the interfacing is the right one for your fabric. So for mine, the Pendleton wool was already very thick, so I wanted to go with something really lightweight because I didn't want to add a lot of extra bulk. All right, I'm going to go cut out my lining and interfacing pieces, and then we can finally get started on constructing the coat. So the first thing is we need to iron the interfacing onto our pieces. The interfacing is what gives certain pieces that nice structured look and gives your coat overall a tailored look rather than the look of a slouchy bathrobe. Most of the pieces are pretty straightforward. The interfacing piece looks exactly the same as the exterior piece, and so it's just a matter of sticking together and ironing on the fusible interfacing on the actual exterior piece. For the front piece here, it's the only piece that looks slightly trickier because it's a different shape. And here, the interfacing piece just goes around that collar area because it's the collar that needs to be nice and crisp and look tailored. So here's our front piece. I'm just going to take the interfacing piece and lay it along this top part here so that it follows the curve. And what will happen is we will fuse these together, and then eventually the lapel will roll over like so. So I'm going to take my iron and start pressing it down. So now that we've got the interfacing all ironed in onto our pieces, it's time to start constructing the coat. I'm going to start by constructing the pocket. We have the pocket facing piece right here, and you need to go ahead and overcast or finish the inside edge of the pocket facing piece. I've gone ahead and done that on my sewing machine using the casting stitch. You can also just use a regular zigzag stitch if you want. And also, of course, if you have a serger, you can use that too. So after finishing the interior edge, we just put the facing onto our pocket bag right here, and going to pin and then sew around the edge, 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. I'm actually going to pin and sew with the slippery pocket bag on top, because I find that the fabric moves around a little bit less if I do it that way. When I do it with the wool on top and the slippery pocket bag on the bottom, the lining fabric tends not to go through the feed dog smoothly. All right, so now that we have installed our facing onto one side of the pocket, we need to take our other pocket bag and install that into the front coat piece. So the pattern as originally drafted suggests that you match up the notches on your pocket with the notches on the front piece of the coat, which would put the pocket right about here. Now I looked online, and a lot of the reviewers said that the pocket was way too low, especially for someone short like me with relatively short arms, and they suggested moving the pocket up by about 2 inches. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to measure here from this top notch 2 inches, put a pin there, and then I'm going to move this piece up here so that the entire pocket now sits 2 inches higher than it would under the pattern as originally drafted. So now that we've got the pocket pinned in, we just need to sew in between these 2 notches. So let's do that. I forgot to mention, by the way, that the seam allowance on this pattern for the most part is 1/2 inch. So that's where I'm putting my seam guide. All right. So now we have the pocket bag sewn into the front here. I'm just going to clip at the notches through to just below the stitching line, making sure that you don't actually cut through the stitching line. So that's now cut. We're going to flip this through to the other side, and now we just need to stay stitch this. You've got your seam allowance down here below the pocket bag, and you're going to stay stitch all the way along this edge here. And what that does is that just prevents the pocket lining from rolling out in the final pocket. So now my pocket is stay stitched to the seam allowance. We just need to take this to the iron and press it in. I have pressed or turned the pocket through to the inside of the front coat piece and given it a nice press. Used a lot of steam on it to get that to be a really crisp edge. And now we need to take the pocket bag with the facing that we made earlier, and we're going to put it on like this and sew around the edges. All right, so now we've got our pocket bag stitched. You can now see, you can stick your pocket or your hand in it. The last step is just to stay stitch these extra bits on the edges of the pocket in place so that they don't flap around later on. So now we've got the pocket fully installed. We just need to repeat this with the other side, and then we can start sewing together the rest of the coat. All right, so the next step is to sew the side seams of the coat together. So I've got my front piece here with the pocket on the inside. I'm just going to stick that on my back piece here, like so. And I'm going to line up this seam, pin it, and then sew it. We just need to make sure that when we're sewing, we don't catch the pocket accidentally in the seam line. So we don't want that. Side seam is now sewn in. Let's just check the pocket still functions. It does. We just need to press this open and then repeat on the other side. Okay, so we've sewn together the body of the coat, and now it's time to sew together the sleeves. So I've got my 2 sleeve pieces here, and we're just going to sew the top seam along the top here. And the only tricky thing here is that we need to match up the print at least slightly. So you can see here we've got this little motif here. We want to match that up. We want to match this black bit right here. Same thing with this motif here, and then right about here. All right, so we've got this top seam sewn in, and now all we have to do is sew in the bottom seam here. Now for this one, it's nice because we don't have any pattern match to do. It's just a solid sort of a bluish purplish color. And so just need to pin, sew, and we're done. So now that we've constructed our sleeves, it's time to set the sleeves into the actual body of the coat. Now luckily these are raglan sleeves as opposed to traditional set-in sleeves, and they're actually a little bit easier to set in than your regular sleeve. So let's get started. You want to start by taking the body of your coat and turning it inside out, because you are going to be matching right sides to right sides of the sleeve. With this particular pattern, typically the underseam of the sleeve will also match up with the side seam of the coat, but that is not the case here on this coat, because the side seam on the coat is actually a little bit forward of kind of the side of your body. So what's actually going to happen is this notch here is sort of in the back of the coat actually matches up with the underarm seam on the sleeve. So you want to match that up. Just going to roughly pin this. And then from there, you will see that the next notch in the sleeve matches up with the side seam on the body of the coat. And then just continue matching up notches all the way along. It's reasonably straightforward. It's just the trickiest part is resisting that impulse to match up the underseam of the sleeve with the underseam, or with the side seam of the coat. Doing the same on the back side. Again, you want to match your notches here. If you don't know, the standard sort of convention on sewing patterns is to have a double notch in the back and a single notch in the front of the sleeve. I remember when I first started sewing, I would always get confused, especially if the sleeve was sort of symmetrical front and back. I would always get confused about which side was which, and I would mix up my right and my left sleeves. But once I realized that the notching changed with a single notch in the front and a double notch on the back, everything just became much easier. Okay, so once we have finished pinning everything, we'll just need to take this to the sewing machine and stitch with our usual 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so we've given the sleeves a nice press. You can see they're nicely attached on both sides. And now we just need to work on the collar, which is these interfaced bits right here. What we will need to do is to match up the right sides of those collar pieces, or the collar portions of the front piece. And the only tricky part here is that we will need to match up the print. You can see it's sort of a mirror image here. We'll just need to match up that print just to make sure it's nice and symmetrical and all those lines match up. All right, so I have sewn together the collar pieces, and I have matched up the print so you can see it's nice and symmetrical on both sides. Now the final step before we move on is we need to just trim or cut slightly into this corner here. And just to clarify where exactly that notch will be that you need to cut. This is the back of the coat. This is the back neckline right here. And this is the front facing piece with the collar piece that we just attached. Where that collar meets the rest of the front facing piece, right here, that's where we need to cut the notch. The reason for that is we need to be able to move this around so that we can pin it smoothly to the neckline, like so. So I have gone ahead and pinned the collar piece to the back neckline. Conveniently, there are notches all the way along to help guide you. There's a notch that will match up to the upper seam of your sleeve. Same on the other side. And there's also a notch that will match up to the back armhole seam for your sleeve. And then the middle, you just want to make sure, if you've cut a mirror image like I have, that your motif going down the middle is lined up in the middle. So now it's time to start working on constructing the facing pieces and the interior of the coat. I've got the front facing pieces lined up here. If you'll recall, these are the facing pieces where I ran out of fabric and I had to piece them together by cutting out the top half from one piece of fabric and then the bottom half from another piece. Luckily, I think you can't really tell that there's this interruption in the pattern unless you're really looking closely. So we've got these pieced together pattern front facing pieces, and now we just need to sew together the upper parts here and here, which will form the collar. This is a very straightforward seam to sew. It's just a straight seam across the top. The only detail here is that, again, because we've got this print, we need to make sure that we match the print so we get a nice matched print along the seam line. Okay, so here's the front facing piece that's pieced together here. I've just folded up these ends to stop the piece from falling down off of my sewing table. But what we need to do next is notch these corners right here. So if you can just see here, here is the front facing piece. This is that center seam that we just sewed. And then here's a little sort of crook or corner in the facing piece. You just want to notch in about 3/8 of an inch because we're going to need to be able to open this up. Same thing on the other side. You want to cut in 3/8 of an inch into that corner, and then we are going to take the neck facing piece like so, and we are going to match up the notches and pin the neckline here to the facing piece here. And you'll see they're very small, but you can see there are notches here, and there are also corresponding notches here and here. So just going to match up those notches, pin, and you're going to end up with something that kind of looks like this. There will be a little bit of an overhang at the edge there, but don't worry, that is perfectly normal. Just sew up to this corner here that you notched and no further than that. All right, so now that the neckline edge has been sewn together. We now need to take the edge of the back neck facing and pivot it around to the armhole edge of the front facing piece. So here's the rest of the front facing piece. Here you can see the entire front facing piece, and we just need to match that edge together. So there will be a little bit of a bulk issue to deal with, but otherwise it's pretty straightforward. So I've sewn together the back neck facing with the front facing pieces, and I've given everything a little press. But one of the things that is really important when you're sewing with a really bulky fabric like a wool coating is that we really need to make sure that we get rid of excess in places where the seams come together. Like here there's a T and there's a bit of an intersection here with a lot of bulk right here in the middle. And then here in the corners, a lot of the fabric there's this excess piece right here, which sort of builds up and creates a lot of bulk. And you don't want that, because if you have this bulk and you leave it in there, when it comes to the final coat, there'll be a little sort of lumpy bump showing on the right side of the coat. So how do we get rid of that? It's really pretty easy. We just trim away the excess fabric. So here, where there's a T in the intersection, I'm just going to snip away a little triangle on this bottom seam here. I'm going to leave the top seam the way it is, but the seam that's on the bottom, I'll clip away these little triangles. You can see them here, and that will allow this seam to now sit flat. And then here in the corners, we just need to snip away that extra fabric. So without cutting too far into the corner, because you don't want to create a hole, I'm just going to snip into there, and then sort of cutting out basically like a diagonal shape. I think I might need to cut just a little bit more here. The seam lays flat, there isn't any more excess fabric flip-flopping around there. Just going to repeat that on the other side here. You need to just cut this, cut a little bit of excess away, not all the way into that seam because you don't want to create a hole in your seam. And then through to the other side. And then now you can see that your fabric will lay smoothly once I press that properly. I might do a little bit more snipping, but I'm going to give it a press first and see how far I get with that. So now we've got the full facing piece done. We've got the front facing piece out here. We've got our neck facing there, and then we've got this front facing here. All that's left to do is attach the facing to the interior of the coat. So one little detail before we move on to install the facing into the coat. When I go thrift shopping for clothes to refashion, I like to look for pieces that have markers of authenticity. So for this particular Pendleton wool blanket, it had this nice little label showing that it was a genuine, authentic Pendleton blanket from the woolen mills in Oregon. And so this was in the corner of the blanket, so it wasn't really in a good place for me to just cut it directly on a pattern piece. So I unpicked the label, and now I am going to put the label here on my neck facing. It is just going to sit kind of in that same place that the labels on your clothing. You'll usually see that there's a label showing the company and the brand name of the clothing that you've got. So I'm going to take that same idea and just go ahead and hand sew, or maybe machine sew, this label on here, just so I have, I've preserved a record of this garment's prior life as a Pendleton wool blanket. Okay, so now for the exciting part. We have the exterior of the coat all constructed, sitting on the dress form, looking pretty good, I think. And then we've got the facing piece that we just put together, and we just need to install the facing into the exterior of the coat. And so what you need to do is to place right side to right side, like this. and then just pin and match up all of the edges along the way, starting from all the way down at the hemline and then all the way up around the collar and then through to the other side. So now that we've got the facing installed inside the coat, we just need to do some understitching to make sure that our fabric, which is on the underside of the garment, doesn't flip out to the exterior of the garment. So you can see, for example, up here where I haven't understitched the fabric yet, the fabric on the on the underside is starting to flip out, and stay stitching will prevent that from happening. Now I have gone ahead and understitched the bottom part of this coat here, and so you can see here, I have understitched right here on the front facing piece. So I've stitched through the front facing piece through to the seam allowance that's on the bottom of that front facing piece. And what that does is just make sure that the front facing has a really hard time flipping out to the outside. I need to do the same thing with the other side. Again, take your front facing piece and stitch through to the seam allowance on the other side. And that'll make sure that that facing stays turned under rather than flipping out. Now above the break line, you actually want to do the exact opposite. And the reason for that is because above the break line, your front exterior piece actually becomes the bottom of the lapel, and your front facing piece becomes the top side of your lapel. So you want to do the exact opposite, where you stitch through your you stitch through your exterior front piece through to the seam allowance that is underneath that. And that will then make sure that this fabric stays tucked underneath and doesn't flip out when you start wearing the coat. So one thing you need to do before you understitch through on the bottom is, because we're working with such bulky wool coating fabric, I'm actually going to so-called grade the seams so that I don't end up with this huge lump here where both thicknesses of the seam allowance are. So I am just going to grade the top seam allowance here, the one that will sit directly underneath the facing. I'm going to just cut it roughly so that it's about 1/4 of an inch, I would say. Just really about half of the current width of the seam allowance. And I'm going to grade it all the way up to my break point. So past this point here. Okay, so grading that seam just makes sure that now when you fold over, you don't just have this ledge where there's a double thickness. You're instead going to have a graduated slope, if you will, from the edge of the fabric through to the end of the seam allowance. So now that it's been graded, we are ready to do the understitching. And so you're going to do that by flipping the front facing piece out, and then making sure that your seam allowance stays turned to your right. That way, when you're sewing through the facing, you're also sewing through both layers of the seam allowance. Then I'm going to just start at the break point, which is right about here. Again, making sure that my seam allowance is pressed over to the right, and I am stitching through both layers of the seam allowance. Now I'm just going to use the side of my walking foot as my guide to keep a consistent distance away from the edge. And off I go. Okay, now that I've understitched the bottom of the coat, we need to understitch the top of the coat above the break point. So we're going to do the exact same thing where we grade the seams, but this time I'm going to grade the other side of the seam allowance because we're going to be stay stitching to to the front side of the fabric instead of the facing piece of the fabric. So on this portion here, I graded this side here. So on this portion now, I'm going to grade this side of the seam allowance. So again, just cutting to roughly about 1/4 of an inch thickness or width all the way around. All right, so now that we've graded that seam, it will be relatively easy. We are just going to flip over our coat, make sure that we place the fabric underneath the presser foot. You're going to be sewing on the actual front piece now instead of the facing piece, and you just want to make sure that your seam allowance is turned underneath that front piece and you're stitching through both layers. So I have understitched the entire exterior of the coat, and I have given it a nice press, and the edges are all nice and crisp, and the undersides don't flip through anymore. So the next step is to secure this part of the collar with this part right here and the other collar. If you don't do that, this will sort of slip and slide and will move out of place, and it won't be very comfortable when you wear it. And so this just ensures that essentially this stays together like so. And no matter how much you move it or you pick it up and put it down again, this collar is going to sort of stay secured where it should be. So it's just a fairly simple step. It does involve some hand stitching, but it's a fairly short seam, so it's not going to take forever. The one thing I would say is that, again, we really need to grade our seams, because as you see, if we put this seam allowance on top of this seam allowance, we're going to have double layers and a lot of bulk. So we just want to make sure that we grade opposite sides of the seam. So I'm going to grade the inside of this seam right here. Again, cutting to about 1/4 of an inch, like so. Then the other side as well. And then the same thing on the top. I'm going to just grade this top seam allowance right here. All right, so now when we match up the seam allowances, you will see that there's a wider seam allowance on the bottom, but then a narrower seam allowance on the top. And then on the other side of the seam, we have the narrower seam allowance and then the wider seam allowance. So on both sides, we've got kind of this graduated slope in the seam allowance. So all we do is we match up the center seams here, then match up the seam line and pin all the way along. And then once you've pinned it, we're just going to do a quick basting stitch by hand through all the layers, so through here and all the way through to the back side of the coat. And that will keep this collar nice and secure. All right, so here's the final constructed outer shell of the coat. Given everything a nice press, you can see that the lapel is sitting nice and flat, and because of that understitching we did, the bottom part of the lapel isn't flipping out. So now that we've got that outer shell done, the next step is to construct the lining. Now I'm not going to show you all the different parts of the construction of the lining, just because it's exactly the same pretty much as the construction of the outer shell of the coat, but did just want to point out two things that do differ ever so slightly.
So this is the back piece of the lining. And first you want to stitch that center back seam down here. You'll need to press your seam allowances over to the right together, not spread apart, but together. And then you will need to form this pleat up here by bringing together the two notches together like so they meet, and then this forms this pleat right here. And what that pleat does is it gives wearing ease to the coat, so that if you, for example, were to spread your arms wide apart and make your back a little bit wider as a result, this pleat gives you that movement in that lining to accommodate that movement. The other thing that is slightly different about construction of the lining is you want to leave a 25 centimeter long gap in the stitching in the underseam of the sleeve. Only in one sleeve though. And that is just so that later on when we bag the lining in the coat, you'll be able to turn the coat through this opening right here. On the other sleeve, you can see, you can just go ahead and sew up the entire seam on the underarm, like so. Now that we've finished constructing our lining, the next step is to put it into our coat. So I'm going to take the exterior coat shell off, and what we need to do is we need to pin the lining into the inside facing edge, matching right sides to right sides. So you can see here, here's the inner facing right here. Here's the edge right here. We're going to take our lining like so, take the right side of the lining and flip it through so that it's matched up with the interior edge of the facing. Just going to give it a quick pin. So I finished sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the facing, the neck facing here, and then all the way around to the other side. So everything is connected, and we just need to flip the lining through to the inside. This is always one of my favorite parts in the sewing project, and you really start to see everything come together. So there's the coat, there's our lining, and now we want to take our sleeves, the sleeve lining piece right here, and just stick that through our sleeve all the way through to the end, like so. And then what we want to do is just make sure that the sleeve lining is sitting in there sort of properly and it's not twisted in any way. So I'm just going to match up the underseam. Hopefully you can see there's the underseam right there, and then there is the underseam in the sleeve lining. So I'm just going to put a pin in there to hold that in place and make sure it doesn't slip and slide and get twisted in the next step, like so. And then the same thing with the top seam. There's the top seam in the sleeve lining, there's the top seam in my actual exterior coat, and just going to match those up and then pin that as well. Okay, so now that we've pinned those two parts of the sleeve, we need to pull the sleeve out again so that both the sleeves are inside out. It's a little bit tricky, but you can do it. So we just pull everything out again. Just be careful if your lining fabric is a bit delicate while you're pulling this through. Sleeve is also really bulky, so it is a little bit harder, but we'll get there. Let's keep pulling. Keep pulling some more. All right, we're finally at the end there. So in order to sew the seam at the edge of the sleeve here, we need to take our sleeve lining and sort of flip it over. Right now the wrong side is to the wrong side
and we don't want that. We want to pin the right side to the right side. So we just take out the pin, flip this over to the inside, like so. Just nestle that in nicely and pin so that we have right side to right side. And then do the same thing on the other side. So from here, it's pretty straightforward. Just going to continue pinning all the way around the rest of this hem and then stitch around with the usual 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I have now pinned around the edge of the hem of the sleeve, matching all the right sides to the right sides. The only trickiness now is that we are going to have to sew with this going into the sewing machine like so. So you're going to have this lining flapping around, which is, it's a little bit bulky, but it's not that big of a deal. We just need to make sure that when we put it into our free arm, that lining kind of sits out of the way and doesn't get accidentally sewn when we're trying to sew through just that single layer of lining that we've pinned. Okay, so now we've got the lining sewn in on all sides here, like so. We've got the sleeves kind of doing this weird thing where they're attached at the hem, and so it sort of forms this loop like this. And now the next step is to pin the lining to the coat at the hem. So I'm going to turn this inside out. We have the right side of the coat here to the right side of the lining here. We just want to match up all of our seams. So this is the center back right here. Here's the side seam right here. I'm just going to pin and match up all of those seams all the way along this hem. So once you've pinned the lining to the hem all the way along, you then need to do one last step right here at the facing. You need to mark in 5 inches from the edge of your coat using some tailor's chalk here. And then you need to mark 2 inches from the hem of your coat. And that is going to be your stitching line. So you want to stitch all the way in 5 inches, and then from that 5 inch mark you're going to taper down to a 1/2 inch, or to your 1/2 inch seam allowance. So something like that. You want to do the same thing to the other side. And then when you sew, you're going to sew from here all the way down, tapering down, a 1/2 inch seam allowance across the hem, and then the reverse on the other side with the facing on the other side. Okay, so I've now stitched all the way along the hem here and tapered up to 2 inches from the bottom at the edges. And now we just need to trim this excess here about a 1/2 inch from your stitching line. It's quite difficult because my fabric is very thick, but here we go. So we've done that on one side, and we just need to do the same on the other. Okay, so now I flipped the coat around, so we're now looking at the interior of the coat fabric, and the lining is down here. Now we need to press the hem 2 inches up, which is basically where my interfacing stops. So we'll use that as our guide. We just need to bring this up. Actually, let's do it where the seam is. 2 inches up, using that seam allowance as a guide. And we need to secure this. So now once you've got that, you're just going to hand stitch. You're going to hand stitch this part here to just the seam allowance, not going through to the right side of the coat. We also want to do basically the same thing in the middle here. Again, using the interfacing as a guide and pinning there. There is no seam allowance here, so it's a little bit more difficult, but because my fabric is so thick, I think I can get away with it. I'm just going to hand stitch and baste this right here so that it goes through basically a little bit of the exterior coat fabric, but doesn't go all the way through to the outside of the coat. Once we've got the hem of the coat tacked on and turned up like this, we want to do the same with the hem of the sleeve. So again, using the interfacing as a guide, just going to turn up the hem of the sleeve. It's a little bit awkward with the sleeve lining attached, but not too bad. Like so. Basically, now that we've turned it up, just going to hand baste that in. Same thing on the other side. Okay, so I basted in and turned up and basted in the hems of my sleeves on both sides. And now we are ready for the most exciting part. We need to turn the coat inside out, or right side out, I guess. And so what you want to do is go to your sleeve where you've left that opening in the sleeve lining, and we're going to use that opening to turn everything out. After wrestling with it for a while, I finally got the entire coat turned through. Got some wrinkles here in the lining in the process, but those can be easily pressed out. So the last step in the turning out process is we need to close up that hole that we used to turn everything through. I'm just going to do that by turning through my sleeve. And here is the hole that I used to turn everything through, and we just need to close that up. Okay, so I finish hand stitching my opening closed, and going to bring the sleeve back out again. There we go. Now we have our bagged coat. So, last step here, we need to give the hem a nice press so that it sits nice and flat. This part here is going to continue to stay sort of open and unsecured like that, so that it allows this to sort of move around as you wear the coat. Okay, so I have pressed all of my hems on both the sleeves and the bottom of the coat, and the final step is to make the buttonholes and sew on the buttons. So I have gone ahead and marked the buttonholes based on the sewing pattern. Basically, these buttonholes are at the level or the line of the break point, which is right here on my coat. The first buttonhole is 3/4 of an inch in from the edge of the coat, and then the next buttonhole is 5.5 inches in from there. And so I had a couple of options in my stash. You need one so-called feature button, which is going to be right here and will kind of be very visible from the outside. And then you want one flat button, which is just going to be on this side on the inside to help hold the coat together. So it's not going to be visible and it needs to be flat, not domed. All right, so finally finished
the buttonholes. You see, and gotten the buttons sewn on. You see there's the main feature button right here. Then if we unbutton that, you can see there's the buttonhole. Then there's our feature button. There's our other buttonhole on the interior right here. And there is our other button, our flat button on the inside that holds the coat closed. And here's the finished coat. I love the colorful bold print and the oversized shawl collar, and the coat is super warm and comfortable to wear. I hope this tutorial was helpful and it inspires you to refashion a vintage wool blanket into a winter coat. Happy sewing!